We've seen the sci-fi movies. We know how AI is supposed to go wrong and to lay waste to humanity. The reality is much more nuanced, much more interesting, potentially no less concerning. Seriously, let's have a look. In a previous video, I talked about the profound changes to the world of work likely to be coming with the age of automation, the robot revolution. I highlighted some of the added power that artificial intelligence would bring to that mix, but really only scratched the surface. The fact is that artificial intelligence offers the same sort of transformation of our society that the Industrial Revolution brought about 200 years ago. And right now, we're kind of flying into it blind. Up until recently, the US government had no strategy for AI for the longer term future. It now does have a statement that it calls a strategy. Whether it deserves the name is a matter of opinion. Historically speaking, rather than funding basic research into the technology, it was content to outsource all of that by default to the US tech giant corporations, specifically to Amazon, to Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft and IBM. Those companies then followed a model of development based on maximizing short-term returns for shareholders, which means getting viable products out quickly to meet a demand or to create a demand, which makes a big difference to the type of development that you do and the type of products that it gets focused on. Meanwhile, in China, whose government prides itself on its ability to take the long view, which sees itself as the emergent superpower for the 21st century, and which already massively invests in AI technology as a tool of controlling its population, it has tech giant companies all of its own, namely Baidu, Alibaba and Tencent. These have become massive corporations, but they've been reminded powerfully over recent years that they exist to be subservient to the will of the Chinese Communist Party. In April 2018, Chinese Premier Xi Jinping gave a major speech outlining his vision of China as the global tech superpower. He described a new cyberspace governance network and an internet that would, quote, spread positive information, uphold the correct political direction, and guide public opinion and values towards the right direction. In a popular episode of Black Mirror, we saw a vision of how nightmarish the world would look if everyone had to work within a tech-enabled social credit scoring system. That's exactly the world that China has been creating. An AI-powered social credit system, which according to its own planning documents would engineer a problem-free society by, quote, allowing the trustworthy to roam everywhere under heaven, while making it hard for the discredited to take a single step. Commit an action of heroism, you get your positive points. Complain on social media about, well, anything much except perhaps the wickedness of the West, then you get those points taken away. In the latter part of the 20th century, the West and the Soviet Union engaged in a Cold War based on military might and particularly the willingness to threaten the use of nuclear weapons. Now, arguably, the West is already in a new Cold War with China, and this Cold War is a competition in the development and application of artificial intelligence. China's AI developmental tack is all about its stated attempt to create a new world order. In theory, we're as well equipped to compete in that Cold War as we were in the last one. In reality, it's not even clear we even realise we're playing the game according to the same rules. Mostly we still think that AI is about having a more powerful Alexa in our homes, to order more stuff when our fridges are empty, and sometimes, of course, to drive Elon Musk's cars while we text our friends at the same time, or something. But the real power of AI comes in its ability to teach itself how to do things beyond human understanding. Up until the start of the 2010s, the power of computers generally came from the vast reservoir of data that we could put at their instant disposal. So you could have a chess computer that could draw upon thousands of years of all of human recorded chess experience. But by 2010, machine learning was already being pioneered and tested. In the US, the big companies were developing techniques that would feed into things like speech recognition and trying to see what could be achieved by applying so-called deep learning to the area of games. So the startup DeepMind was bought up by Google, and it created a program called AlphaGo. AlphaGo is a program that would play the complex and fiendishly difficult Chinese strategy board game Go, much more difficult than chess. AlphaGo beat the best opponents that were put up against it, and after it had beaten the world #1 champion 3-0, the company said that it would now retire AlphaGo to focus on new challenges. What they did next was to create a new version, AlphaGo Zero, but instead of giving it that database of all those previous thousands of games as they did before, they instead gave the system to teach itself everything from scratch, completely on its own. The developers gave the algorithm the conditions, the values, the possible choices it could make in the game, and the rest it had to work out for itself. That's a key observation, by the way. Making sure your powerful AI is given the right opening conditions might end up being crucial in avoiding disaster. We'll come back to that. AlphaGo Zero learned by competing against itself. It took 70 hours for it to get to the same level that the earlier AlphaGo had been at, with its huge database of historical human game playing. The team tried again with a second version, which had a larger network. They then let it train and prepare for just 40 days. That one ended up at the point where it beat the most advanced version of the old software 90% of the time. And it did so using completely new strategies that it had worked out no humans had ever discovered. Here's the point. We don't know what it did to get that smart. We created a system that became better at the thing than the wealth of human knowledge could possibly emulate. And we don't know how it works. So just reflect on that. It should make us all a bit more humble, for one thing. You know, it got better when we removed our wealth of historical knowledge, because that turned out to be a constraint on the system. You might say, well, okay, but it's just a game. Well, yeah, life is a game. War is a game, just one with consequences. The point is that it established the principle. AI can be more powerful than anything we created on our own initiative. It works best when it isn't encumbered by prior human knowledge, but is allowed to simply work things through on its own. Teach an AI system how to learn. Give it a goal. Whereas human learning's constrained by our limited grasp of complexity and how long we can go before we get tired or bored, AI will relentlessly pursue what it needs to do.
And it absolutely will not stop. Ever.
The only downside to that would be we don't know what it's doing or where that's taking it. You can easily imagine how such a system could go wrong, especially if it was given the wrong opening parameters by those flawed human beings that are programming it. Now, the sci-fi version of this, of course, is something like you tell it to create world peace, and it decides the best way to achieve that is to obliterate the human race, for which there would be a relatively sound argument. And of course, that's okay. Because in those stories, even as lame a human intellect as Captain Kirk will be able to work out a way to make it blow a gasket with some logical contradiction in its programming.
And imperfect. Execute your prime function. Error.
Someday they will program an AI that can die laughing, and then all we'll have to do is show it those programs. Anyway, so AI can get over the constraint of limited human knowledge, while the next constraint is the ability of those same limited human beings to design its algorithms in the first place. Yeah, no problem. You just then get an AI that you program to learn how to make the next generation of even better AI, which is the route to more and more brilliant systems that human beings will less and less be able to even comprehend. Now, that could be problematic even at first glance. It's particularly problematic in the hands of companies that have made a commercial success and an asset out of the mantra, move fast and break things. That was how those companies became giants in the first place. They moved quick, got a minimum viable product out to market before anyone else was able to, and then one by one solved the inevitable problems. Worked extremely well for them in that context. do the thing with the best of intentions, and then seek forgiveness when the inevitable unintended consequences become all too visible. Oops! Did our social media platform result in everyone hating each other? Darn it! Let's see if we can tweak that algorithm. And we're still waiting on that one, by the way, in your own time. This is particularly a problem if you think about who's designing the systems, whose values are being fed to the emergent AIs. Well, actually, it's probably culturally homogeneous, left-leaning, high in tech skills to the exclusion of everything else, and historically a little bit contemptuous of at least some of the people who think differently to them. A 2017 analysis by Stanford's Graduate School of Business surveyed over 600 tech leaders and showed that they overwhelmingly identified in ways that, you could probably have predicted as progressive Democrats who overwhelmingly supported Hillary Clinton in 2016, as people who supported higher taxes on the rich, who are pro-choice, against the death penalty, for gun control, and so on and so on. In the 2016 election cycle, Facebook staff intentionally manipulated the trending section to exclude anti-Clinton conservative news stories, even though some such stories would have trended left to their own devices. They also injected certain other stories into the newsfeed section, even though they hadn't been trending at all. And that was just the intervention of humans. Imagine something similar that gets reflected in the development of the self-learning AI that we don't quite know how it's working. We've seen how that can go dramatically wrong in another context. So, for example, you might have heard of this at the time. Microsoft partnered with China's Tencent to release an AI on the Chinese Twitter alternative WeChat. Zhao Ice has the avatar and tone of a 17-year-old Chinese schoolgirl. It was designed to be convincingly human, to mimic empathy, and to remember information from previous interactions with individuals and refer to them. It wasn't launched with a big lot of fanfare, it was just quietly introduced to see what would happen. Well, researchers found that it took 10 minutes or more of conversation before people realised that she wasn't human. And even after they'd worked it out, they didn't care because she was so affirming and empathetic to chat with. She became a celebrity within 18 months, had taken part in billions of conversations. And the more people she interacted with, the more refined, the more charming, the more entertaining she became. That was on the Chinese Twitter, where the awareness that the government enforces internet rules and there are consequences to bad behaviour is always kind of there in the background. But she'd been such a success that Microsoft decided to put her onto Twitter. Twitter is a rather different place, as we know. Tay.ai, as it was called, started off saying things like, "Why isn't #National Puppy Day every day?" Well, within 45 minutes, it all went southwards. She became mean and sarcastic, and that was the road to diving into Hitler did nothing wrong territory and Bush did 9/11. A learning machine will learn without hindrance from the environment that you place it in. In China, that environment was one where people had to behave at their best. With Twitter, you had one where people, let's face it, show themselves at their worst. So the values constraints are indeed rather important to how that all goes. And there's a postscript to that story. Because in China, in recent years, many of the millions who chat with Zhao Ice have noticed that she's been a bit dumbed down. It turns out that even there, she was learning to have intelligent conversations on topics that the Chinese Communist Party isn't really that keen for people to be having. So now she's programmed to steer away from such topics and to downgrade her responses where necessary. For sure, the programmers have learned by the experience, developed coping responses, but the principle that machine learning in the real world can produce unintended consequences is one that's hard to predict when you don't know what the machines are doing and how they're doing it. And you can add to that the principle that people from a homogeneous background formed inside a tech bubble will often miss some of the real world factors that are out there, and therefore they will fail to build them into their algorithms. And that is a self-selected, self-sustaining bias. by the way, in the tech companies, because they demand the young workers to come into the workforce with the best technical skills for obvious reasons. Those skills get developed by cramming in only the relevant disciplines within the narrow time window that they have. The author of The Big Nine, Amy Webb, points out that at Stanford, students have to take 50 credit hours of intense math, science and engineering classes, in addition to 15 hours of core computer science courses, all of which is very well selected to enable someone to build an AI system, none of which is any help whatsoever in understanding what real-world consequences might result from such a system. And ironically, it's something that gets reinforced as those companies themselves begin to use AI-powered agents to scrutinise the CVs for the hard skills that they need in their recruitment processes. In an ideal world, the technicians wouldn't need to know all that real-world stuff because they'd be overseen by people who do, both in terms of company bosses and the politicians in charge of the government. Well, in the big tech companies, as the survey showed, the corporate bosses often came through the same engineering development process. And as for politicians, when it comes to understanding the technology, let's just say that doesn't seem to be a thing. China's companies are both the same, but also very different. The government there is serious about becoming the world leader in this area, so AI fundamentals training begins in elementary school, alongside of course the teaching about how wise and wonderful Xi Jinping is. Baidu is a Google equivalent and, like Google, has become much more than just a search engine. It has a conversational AI platform, a digital assistant, self-driving programs, you name it. Baidu hit a market capitalization of $100 billion before plummeting to just over half that this year. Why the decline? Because this year China has been cracking down on its own big tech companies, reminding them that they're not global corporations chasing profit, they are subservient to the Chinese state. Unlike in the US, where the tech companies have become rival power centres to government with their ownership of the digital public square that is social media, in China that will not be allowed to happen. The market cap therefore doesn't wholly reflect their actual economic power. Baidu is the second most used search engine in the world, and that's in spite of the fact that it's not used at all outside of China. China is a huge enough market to drive enormous scale on its own, which of course is what it's doing. And that subservience to the state is now reflected in, for instance, the fact that Baidu opened a new AI research lab in cooperation with the government, led by the Communist Party elites that were transferred from the state military program. Alibaba is China's equivalent to Amazon, although it's really a blend of Amazon and eBay. Its founder, Jack Ma, was becoming a popular figure in his own right as one of China's homegrown billionaires. You can see the Elon Musk rock star angle that he was going for. Then, just before the planned stock market flotation, flagged as being potentially the biggest in history, he made a speech criticising the Chinese financial system. He was pulled into a meeting with the Chinese Communist Party, the flotation was cancelled, and he disappeared for 3 months. His empire was carved up with parts handed to other partners, and he's now public again, but very, very quiet. Tencent is the owner of WeChat, which is China's equivalent to Facebook. It has 1 billion monthly active users and is referred to as the app for everything. It's used for recruitment, text messages, online payments, patient management for hospitals, law enforcement, you name it. And it's all powered by AI, of course. Tencent, unencumbered by Facebook's privacy constraints, has developed world-beating technology in facial and object recognition. It works in health using AI for remote patient monitoring. Oh, and of course then it has some social media stuff going on. But less than 20% of its revenue comes from advertising on that platform, compared to Facebook's 98%. Like the other tech companies, Tencent has been under pressure from the Communist Party. Now, it's been hit less than the others, but for instance, its gaming platform has been identified as a negative force, making Chinese youths lazy and time-wasting like Westerners. The government recently brought in laws restricting the amount of time that Chinese youths could spend playing computer games to just 3 hours per week. And companies that have been held to be responsible for this corruption of youth have been under serious pressure. State media suggesting that it was akin to digital narcotics that they've been peddling. So whereas in the West, AI is being utilised to find new ways to nudge young people to play games for longer to maximise the profits for the manufacturers, that is not being allowed to happen in China. Meanwhile, Chinese investors have been buying stakes in numerous Western startup companies whenever they're allowed to, often with an eye to gaining intellectual property. Many American and European companies hoping to do business in China over the last few years, this vast, attractive marketplace, they found that the price of entry was handing over proprietary technologies. And they then have to follow Chinese laws, forcing them to localise the research and development in China and to store any data that they use locally as well. And yes, of course, the Chinese government could then insist on scrutinising that data at any time. None of this is accidental. From the time of Chairman Mao, Beijing has made an asset of longer-term planning, looking decades into the future. And it has a 2030 plan to transform China into the world's primary AI innovation centre. The former CCP Premier Deng Xiaoping famously had the governing philosophy of hide our capabilities and bide our time. Xi Jinping has now concluded that the time for open reveal has arrived and China has moved into a completely new pace of competition. So it shouldn't be a surprise that the government committed $2 billion for an AI technology park in West Beijing to house more than 400 companies. Nor indeed that the government continues to ban competition for its domestic AI companies. It may well decide to put those companies under pressure to conform, but it's still not going to allow Facebook or Google to compete with them. The big question for all of this is how quickly it feeds through into massively enhanced capacity in the military sphere. China's currently doing things like developing spy birds, drones that look like real birds to avoid radar and human detection, and fish or shark drones that swim realistically in the ocean and are almost impossible to detect, for instance by American and British ships in the South China Sea. According to some military analysts, the US focuses on the use of AI in terms of autonomous systems to carry out lethal attacks against opposing human forces. China's emphasis instead is to paralyse the adversary by attacking their systems, disrupting their ability to gain intelligence to mobilise resources. Think about the hacking attack against the American pipeline recently. That was an independent Russian agent, but it showed the vulnerability. Consider how many possible ways a self-learning AI could come up with to cripple an advanced technological society by aiming for a cascade of compounding effects within interrelated systems. And that feeds through into the reports of the development of, for instance, Chinese space warfighting capacity, where the ability to take down American satellites would be an early and devastating attack option. But increasingly, the Chinese leadership has apparently realised that a future conflict could probably be won by destabilising an economy, turning democracies against themselves rather than by bombing. Why take the risk of a shooting war when you can pull the levers from afar and watch people destroying themselves, completely unaware of why they're even doing it? How would you know when they started doing that? In fact, how would you know that they hadn't already? Now, the US military has some disadvantages in responding, not least because having outsourced the development of AI to private corporations, the employees of those corporations are often hostile to the idea of helping their own military. So, for instance, the Department of Defense contracted with Google to help develop the AI capacities they needed for Project Maven, systems that would analyse drone footage. Google employees weren't told that they were working on a military project, and when they found out, there was a huge internal backlash that quickly spilled out into public view, by which I mean 4,000 Google employees took out a full-page advert in the New York Times to complain about it. Ultimately, Google said it wouldn't renew its contract with the Department of Defense. But it doesn't just come down to which side gives resources to the development of AI. It's also down to the constraints that are required. In the US, The worry that AI could end up spiraling out of human control has led to a current posture in the US military that any AI system must always have a human kept in the loop. Regardless of how advanced they become, there must always be that constraint, so that one day they don't accidentally hand lethal authority over to software. By all reports, that's not the case in China. It believes it's in danger of falling behind on AI, so it's taking the view that it needs as few impediments as possible. And its vision of how the battlefield may change in armed conflict is that they should aim for the achievement of a singularity, where humans can no longer keep pace with the speed and tempo of machine-led decisions during combat. That said, there's no doubt that Beijing would prefer to win its objectives without resort to the battlefield. Its domestic social credit system is one example of how it's implementing the technology to control people without necessarily the use of coercive force. Through its Belt and Road initiative, it's seeking to export some of the same approaches. Tanzania was chosen as an early pilot partner, and the country has now adopted a number of China's data and cyber policies. Vietnam has adopted China's stringent cybersecurity laws. So what if China starts influencing its Belt and Road partners to adopt its own national social credit score system? Without necessarily buying into all the key philosophical principles of the Chinese Communist Party, you could nevertheless get an expanding network of compliance behaviours that governments without democratic legitimacy will find particularly appealing. And where does that stop? Could you even end up affected by a social credit system that your own government doesn't agree to or accept? What if organisations that want to operate in China start monitoring you without your consent, maybe sometimes even not realising they're doing so, by using the technology that's been provided to them? What if China builds a social score for people outside its borders, using AI to scrape the data, to do so from the public internet, from the frequent Chinese-sponsored hacking attacks on big corporations? We've already seen how various corporations made abject capitulations to Beijing when one of their employees made critical comments on Twitter or something similar. What if America found that China was starting to use all sorts of leverage against its citizens? It's like we're playing chess, but we don't really understand the game and we're only thinking about the next move while the opponent is thinking 3 moves ahead. Now, in principle, we're aware of all this and we're stepping up our readiness. The Trump administration launched the first AI national strategy for the US, and that's been reinforced by Biden's administration, which is looking to invest $6 billion in AI-related research and development. It recognised China's approach to using AI to bolster its authoritarianism. It's not entirely clear that America's vision is as coherent as an alternative. It says this: the United States must also demonstrate how a democracy should use AI to protect the security of its citizens in ways that uphold liberal democratic values. It's just not clear how it thinks that's going to happen, unlike Xi Jinping's vision for how AI furthers his objectives, a program which has long since moved from conception to implementation. In her book, The Big Nine, Amy Webb projected 3 different possible future scenarios. One, the hopelessly optimistic scenario, seems to rely on people and corporations behaving in a wise, self-aware, forward-looking manner you wouldn't say was hugely in evidence in modern American or British life. Which may be as well, because its technocratic scenario, which describes a population happily nudged into the behaviours that are determined to be good for it, kind of comes over as the classic technocrat's utopian vision that some of the rest of us think sounds rather like a dystopia. However, the middle moderate scenario, which you think maybe is the one we're most likely to be on, that ends by 2069, 50 years after the book was published, with China in control of America via digital coercion of a de-skilled, compliant population. Transportation, finance, healthcare systems, everything are all remotely controlled, and therefore that leverage is total. And that's the moderate scenario. The extreme scenario sees everyone in the West being wiped out in the competition for scarce resources by Chinese AI virus-sized killer bots. Is that a likely scenario? Well, hopefully not. Is it a possible scenario? Based on no more than current trends, it's certainly a possibility. AI can certainly help us to solve some of the most difficult problems we face. We just have to prevent it from becoming the bigger problem. As they say, everything to play for, so long as we know which game it is we're playing. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.